This Muslim just said Islam is not promoting anything bad. Let's test that. In Islam's prescriptive system, classically, God's law includes religious subjugation, which is the Jizya, lethal punishment for leaving the faith, sexual access tied to ownership, mutilation and severe public punishments, permission structures for wife discipline, and legal categories that include prepubescent divorce waiting periods. Now let's address Aisha and the fact that she was playing with dolls, because that, in and of itself, is extremely significant.
Islam is this and Muslims are that, blah, blah, blah. All these people trying to throw shade on Islam, but the truth of the matter is that you never heard for yourself a Muslim say anything bad. The only thing you ever hear us talking about is praying 5 times a day, keeping people off of drugs and alcohol, and giving to the needy. We're not promoting anything bad, so y'all can keep throwing shade all you want to.
Right now we're going to do something much simpler and much more uncomfortable. We're going to read Islam's prescriptive text. That means the Quran's commands and permissions and the Sunnah, like you said, the Hadith especially, where classical Islam built law from. Then we'll ask a basic ethical question. If these texts are perfect guidance for all time, what happens when they're applied, especially when Muslims actually have political authority? Now, before we go any further, I need to say this clearly. This video is not an attack on Muslims as human beings. Muslims are also made in the image of God. Many Muslims are kind, generous, family-oriented people. I know that. But nice Muslims exist doesn't answer the question, what do Islam's authoritative sources command and permit? We're going to do this clearly, and here's the structure of this video. First, we're going to go through Jihad and Expansion, where the Quran commands fighting and subjugation. Then we're going to go to the Dhimmi System, the Jizya and the humiliation and submission framework. Then we're going to go to apostasy and the death penalty in Sahih Hadith. Then we're going to go to slavery and sexual access, those your right hand possess. Then we're going to go through the hudud punishments, amputation, crucifixion, lashes, and stoning. Then we're going to go to domestic authority, where, the wife discipline is there and striking your wife. Then we're going to go to child marriage indications through Surah 65 verse 4 and the Aisha doll narrations, which is very significant to her prepubescence. Then the dilemma after, either these are divine and timeless or they aren't. There's no spin, there's no theatrics, it's just the sources. So let's begin. When someone says Islam doesn't promote anything bad, I'm going to assume they mean Islam does not prescribe anything morally evil. So what counts as bad here? I'm going to use standards that most humans across cultures recognize as wrong. This includes forced religious hierarchy and coercion based on belief, violence authorized against people of religious status, killing people for changing their religion, sexual exploitation tied to ownership, mutilation punishments like amputation, cruel punishments like crucifixion or stoning, permission structures for domestic violence, legal frameworks that normalize marriage or divorce categories for prepubescent girls. That's the ethical standard we're testing. Now let's look at the texts. The common defense is Islam only fights in self-defense. Now, that sounds nice, but the question is not what modern Muslims prefer. The question is what Islam sources prescribe. Let's start with Surah 2, verse 216. Fighting has been prescribed for you, though you dislike it. Now, that's not mere permission. That's obligation language. Now, Muslims will often say, sure, that's when Muslims were attacked. But the Quran doesn't stop at defense. You get directives that describe aggressive pursuit once conditions are met. Surah 9 is one of the clearest places to see this. Surah 9 verse 5, often called the sword verse, after a set period it commands, kill the polytheists wherever you find them, capture them, besiege them, and lie in wait for them. Now some Muslims will respond, that's about treaty breakers. Yes, the passage has treaty context, but here's the point. Even under that context, the solution prescribed is not peaceful arbitration, it's a violent coercion with a deadline. And then Surah 9 verse 29 expands the war framework to Jews and Christians. It says to fight the people of the book until they pay the jizya and are subdued. Now let's hold that thought because we're going to camp there in the next section. But also notice how the Quran describes the mechanisms of war. Surah 47 verse 4 says, when you meet the disbelievers in battle, strike their necks. Surah 8 verse 12 depicts Allah commanding angels to strike necks and fingertips. Now you can say war is war, fine. But now we have to ask, what wars are being authorized and against whom? Surah 9 verse 29 makes that explicit, fighting people of the book until they accept a subordinate legal status under Islam. That's not simply defense. So let's go to the Dhimmi System. Surah 9 verse 29 is one of the most politically revealing verses in the Quran. It instructs Muslims to fight the Jews and the Christians until they pay Jizya and are subdued. Now here's what matters most. The classical tafsir doesn't treat subdued as a vague, they pay taxes like everyone else. It's tied to status. Classical commentators like Al-Jalalain explain the phrase in a way that highlights compliance and subjugation. The point is not simply revenue. The point is a structured hierarchy. Islam rules, non-Muslims submit and pay. Now, Muslims today often say, that's historical, we don't do that. But we're not discussing what you do today. We're discussing whether Islam's source promotes it, meaning they legislate it. And they do. And this is where a claim Islam promotes nothing bad runs into a problem. Islam's ideal political order, when Muslims have authority, includes a religious tax and subordination mechanism for Jews and Christians. That is religious inequality built into law. Now let's move to a place where coercion is even sharper. This is one of the clearest bad prescriptions because it directly targets individual conscience. If religion claims no compulsion, you'd expect people to be free to leave. But classical Islam does not treat apostasy as you do you. The strongest evidence here is not even in the Quran, it's the Hadith, and specifically the most authoritative collections. Sahih Bukhari records a statement attributed to the Prophet, whoever changes his religion, kill him. Now this is as blunt as it gets. And it's not alone. Sahih Muslim contains the most famous report. The blood of a Muslim is not lawful except in 3 cases. And one of those cases is the one who leaves his religion and separates from the community. So in other words, leaving Islam is placed alongside murder and adultery in terms of punishable outcomes. Now, Muslims often respond, that's only for treason, that's only for war. But the core text is framed as changing religion, and the classical legal tradition built a real penalty structure from it. And here's the ethical problem. A religion that says, if you leave, you die, is not simply promoting good, it's promoting religious coercion by lethal force. And notice the logic. Apostasy becomes a crime against the state of Islam because Islam is not merely a spiritual faith in classical form, it's a comprehensive political legal system. So when someone says Islam doesn't promote anything bad, ask them, does Islam's legal tradition treat changing a religion as a capital crime? Because the Hadith evidence is there and it is prescriptive. Now let's go to a topic that many Muslims will try to soften by saying slavery existed everywhere. Yes, slavery existed. The question is whether Islam reformed it toward abolition or codified it as a lawful sexual category. Let's look. Surah 4 verse 24 gives a list of women forbidden in marriage, and it includes married women. But then it gives an explicit exception, except those whom your right hands possess. Meaning captive women can be lawful even if they previously had husband. And this isn't guesswork. Sahih Muslim explicitly connects this verse to captives from a battle where the companions hesitated because the women were married. Then the verse was revealed to permit the relationship. Very convenient. Right there. Right. It's like, oh wait, Allah revealed something. So right there, the verse was revealed to permit the relationship after a waiting period to ensure no pregnancy. So the Quran provides the permission category and Sahih Muslim provides the application. Then you have the broader Quranic ethic of sexual boundaries. Surah 23 verse 5 to 6 praises believers who guard chastity except with their wives or those their right hands possess. Surah 70 repeats it. This is a standing category. Lawful sex with wives, lawful sex with owned women. And that's concubinage. Here's the thing. The claim Islam doesn't promote anything bad collapses here if you believe sexual access tied to ownership is bad. Because Islam's texts don't merely describe slavery historically, they incorporate it into a moral and legal category. Now, Muslims today often say we don't have slaves now. Fine. But if Islam is timeless, why is a slave sex category embedded in its moral framework? If Islam is timeless, the category isn't bad, it's good, or at least lawful, and that's the problem. Now let's move to punishments, hudud, because this is where the Quran and Hadith become unmistakably legal. These are not fringe interpretations. These are direct legal prescriptions. First you have theft, and that's amputation. So Surah 5 verse 38 says, cut off the hands of the thief. There's juristic discussion about conditions, thresholds, evidence standards. Yes, but the penalty itself is not rehab or restoration. It is bodily mutilation as divine law. Then we have waging war and spreading corruption. Surah 5 verse 33 sets out a menu of punishments: execution, crucifixion, cutting off hands and feet on opposite sides, or exile. Again, scholars debate which applies to which crime, but it is there in the text. And then you find hadith narratives like Bukhari showing brutal enforcement in certain cases. Then we look at zina, lashes, and in the hadith stoning, Surah 24 verse 2 prescribing 100 lashes for sexual immorality. It even says to not let pity prevent you from applying Allah's law, and it frames the punishment as public deterrence. Muslims sometimes say there's no stoning in the Quran, but the hadith corpus is full of stoning narratives and legal framing, especially in Sahih Muslim, where stoning is treated as part of the prophetic legal practice for married offenders. In classical Islam, the Quran gives lashes, Sunnah gives stoning for certain categories, jurists systematize it as law. Now you can defend the evidentiary standards for witnesses, confession rules, etc., but the claim wasn't Islam has legal safeguards. The claim was Islam doesn't promote anything bad. If you believe stoning people or amputating limbs is morally bad, then Islam's prescriptive sources contain morally bad prescriptions. Now we move to state punishments to the home. Surah 4 verse 34 is one of the most controversial verses in the Quran for a reason. It lays out a staged response to a wife's nushuz, often translated as rebellion, ill conduct, or disobedience. The steps are commonly given as admonish, abandon the bed, strike. Now, Muslims might say it means lightly. Some will say it means separate. It means symbolic. But classical tafsir like Ibn Kathir does not erase the striking. It regulates it. Meaning, in the classical tradition, the verse is permission to physically discipline within limits. And here's the apologetic point. Even light striking is still striking. If you need a divine verse to authorize any level of domestic violence as a corrective method, then your moral claim is already in trouble. And if the response is, well, that's culture, then the question becomes, why did the Quran legislate it? Now, we need to address the child marriage indicator, because this is where many Muslims get defensive, and it's also where the text gets very specific. Let's talk about child marriage in Islam. Surah 65 is about divorce law and the iddah waiting periods. Surah 65 verse 4 gives waiting periods for women who no longer menstruate and for those who have not yet menstruated. Now, classical tafsir is explicit here. Ibn Kathir explains this is referring to the young who have not reached the age of menstruation. This means the text of Islamic divorce law includes a category for girls who have not yet begun their menses. Now sure, this verse doesn't say go marry children, but it does legislate divorce periods for a category that classical exegetes understood as too young to menstruate. That implies a marriage recognized in law. And if someone says, well, no, this means irregular cycles, the tafsir history is a problem because major classical commentators read it literally as pre-menstruation. Now let's address Aisha and the fact that she was playing with dolls, because that in and of itself is extremely significant. Sahih Bukhari contains a report where Aisha says she used to play with dolls in the Prophet's presence. And classical commentary, most famously Ibn Hajar in Fath al-Bari, connects that to the idea that dulls were permitted for her because she had not yet reached puberty. But the most direct connection comes from Sahih Muslim. Sahih Muslim has a narration stating that when she was taken to the Prophet's house as a bride at 9, her dulls were with her. So the chain is this. She's described as a bride at 9. Her dulls are mentioned as being with her in that time frame. Classical commentary explicitly treats dulls as evidence of prepubescence. Now, can you prove puberty status with absolute scientific certainty from dulls? No. But you don't need to overclaim. The apologetic point is that the Hadith tradition itself portrays her as a child in the marriage narrative, and classical commentary uses the dull's detail to argue she had not yet reached puberty. So when someone says Islam promotes nothing bad, you can ask, do Islam's most authentic traditions portray a prophetic marriage consummated at 9 with textual indicators of childishness and classical commentary suggesting prepubescence? Because if the answer is yes, the moral claim becomes very difficult to sustain for most modern audiences. Now at this point, Muslims will take one of two routes. The first escape route is context, context, context. You'll hear Surah 9:29 was for that time. Surah 9 verse 5 was for treaty breakers. Hudud was conditions. Apostasy is treason. Right-hand possession was reform. Surah 4 verse 34 is symbolic. Here's the question. If Islam is timeless and perfect guidance, why does it require constant modern moral apologizing to survive contemporary ethical scrutiny? If the defense is that was then, you've admitted time-boundedness. And once you admit time-boundedness, the entire claim Islam is perfect, final, and for all people until the end starts to wobble. The second escape route is you're misreading. Only scholars can read this. Only they can understand this. But here's the issue. I'm not inventing these conclusions out of thin air. I'm just reading. I'm reading the Qur'an, then I'm citing mainstream classical tafsir like Ibn Kathir and Al-Jalalain, and then I'm citing Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. If the defense is you're not a scholar, then the question is, are Ibn Kathir and Al-Jalalain not scholars? Are Bukhari and Muslim not authoritative? If the classical tradition itself reads these as laws, punishments, and permissions, then the issue is not my reading. The issue is the text and its legacy. Now I want to pivot for a moment, because as a Christian apologist, I'm just not here to critique, I'm also here to compare visions of God. Let me show you the core difference. In Islam's prescriptive system, classically, God's law includes religious subjugation, which is the Jizya, lethal punishment for leaving the faith, sexual access tied to ownership, mutilation and severe public punishments, permission structures for wife discipline, and legal categories that include prepubescent divorce waiting periods. Now compare the center of Jesus' ethic. Jesus says in Matthew 5 verse 44, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, not fight them until they pay. Jesus refuses coercion as a means of faith, and the New Testament never authorizes killing apostates, stoning adulterers, or enslaving captives as a sexual category. Now, Christianity has had sinful people and corrupt empires, absolutely. But the question is what the founder and the scriptures prescribe. At the heart of Christianity is not conquest by law, it's God conquering hearts through the cross. No, I'm not pretending Christians have always lived that out perfectly. We haven't. But the standard is there, and it condemns us when we fail. So here's the final dilemma I want to leave with my Muslim friends. If Islam is truly the final perfect guidance for all times, then the prescriptions we've read are not bad. They would be good. They're divine. This means amputations are good, jizya subjugation is good, apostasy execution is good, slave concubinage is good, wife striking is good, stoning is good. And if you feel the need to say no, those are not good today, then you've already conceded the opposite of timeless perfection, because you're appealing to a moral standard outside the text to soften the text. So which is it? Either the texts are timeless and morally right, no matter how they sound today, or the texts are time-bound, morally limited, and require modern revision. Once you choose B, the claim Islam promotes nothing bad is not defensible. My Muslim friend, I'm not asking you to hate Islam. I'm asking you to read it honestly. And I'm asking you to consider Jesus, not as a prophet inside Islam, but as he is in the gospel, the Son of God who gives himself for sinners, who calls people by truth and grace, not by sword or coercion. If you want to talk about any of these sources in detail, I'm open. But don't tell me Islam promotes nothing bad, while the prescriptive texts say what they say. Read them, face them, and then ask, is this truly the voice of the Holy God?